All right. With that said, let's go ahead and transition to our best picture movie series. We
Yeah.
are currently going through the 1940s,
Hmm.
and then we'll take some sort of a break and we'll circle back with a different decade in
Yep.
some time, whatever that looks like. I don't really know at the current moment, but as it stands, we're going through the 40s and we only have three more films left to do,
Yeah.
including this week's review, which is Elia Kazan's Gentleman's Agreement
Yep.
from 1947, which was a first time watch for me.
Same
Is
here. Same here.
okay, that's what I wanted to ask you as well. I do believe we noted that on last week's show, but I wanted to
I think so.
ask
Yeah.
once again. So, this was a first time watch for the both of us. I'm curious to dig into this film. Brennan, anything else you want to lay out here before we jump in?
Um, w- I, I, f- I guess for listeners, maybe if you're familiar with what we had to say about other films in this series, especially early on, I think you might notice some parallels in our thoughts, at least from me on certain things. At least, like, given the trajectory of this movie series and how it relates to America's relationship with World War II specifically.
Mm-hmm.
This movie has a place. Like, this movie fits that narrative. It makes sense as to why this won Best Picture.
Yeah.
Yet, I think there are other things we might say. I don't know how you feel about this film, JD. I'm actually really interested on this. But given my thoughts, I feel like I may be saying some of the same things I said about previous movies in this series. I
Okay.
think this could end up being one of our most repetitive reviews if you've listened to every review in this series thus far. I'll at least
Okay.
say that given my thoughts on it.
Okay. No, I am real curious for this. I am excited to see how this goes because, as we noted with our conversation on Evil Does Not Exist, for those that might have checked out that conversation, I'm
Yeah.
approaching this very similarly in the sense
Okay.
that I have a few notes here. I don't have many, partially because we're doing this on Father's Day and it was a very busy day for me. So I didn't
Mm-hmm.
have too much time to formulate a lot of notes, although I probably should have. I wish that I had more time because this is a film that is going to spark debate for sure, especially given the times that we're in
Mm-hmm.
now. But wanted to see where this goes. I think this is going to be a conversation where, at least for me, my thoughts on it evolve in a real time sense as we go here. So
Okay.
I'm excited to see how that plays
Yeah, I'm
out.
curious. I'm really curious.
So let's jump in. Gentleman's Agreement, directed by Elia Kazan, and it stars Gregory Peck, Dorothy McGuire, John Garfield, Celeste Holm, Anne Revere, and many more that come and go throughout the film. If you're not familiar with Gentleman's Agreement, it is about a reporter who pretends to be Jewish in order to cover a story on anti Semitism and personally discovers the true depths of bigotry and hatred.
Mm-hmm.
As we jump in here as well, while I haven't seen the film until this week, there might be certain aspects to the film and the making of this film that people are familiar with. Every week it seems as if Brendan is ready to go with some trivia surrounding these movies we're talking about. And if you
I have some
read
trivia. I have some
if you
trivia.
read some of the background on this film and how it came about, it is really compelling
Mm.
and it does speak to some of the passion and convictions of this film for sure. So, with
Yeah.
all of that laid out, Brendan, what did you think about
Well,
Gentleman's Agreement?
it certainly explains maybe why this film was made, especially if you know the history of one Elia Kazan or Kazan, I guess is how you pronounce his name. I've heard it both ways.
Mm-hmm.
And you look at his relationship with the anti-communist party specifically, right? Which I
Mm-hmm.
don't think we necessarily need to get into. I feel like if you are a film nerd, you know Elia's relationship with uh, his actions during his HUAC testimony specifically, and how that
Mm-hmm.
ruffled some feathers for him in Hollywood. So I think that certainly speaks to his desire to make this movie, Gentleman's Agreement specifically, which was arguably his first notable quote unquote issues movie. And he has
Hmm.
delved with these things a lot in his movies in some way. So that makes sense. And I think for the time in 1947, when this came out, the overall concept of this movie about a Christian man, a Christian reporter, posing undercover in a sense as a Jewish man to learn about anti Semitism, that is a compelling idea. In some ways, it's kind of an offensive idea. And I couldn't help but think of some of the sillier scenarios that we've seen in other movies where they take this similar approach but turn them into like comedic puff pieces. Movies like How to Lose a Guy in 10 Days, for instance, which is
Hmm.
nothing like this movie, but I have to maybe give a movie like Gentleman's Agreement some appreciation for perhaps spearheading a narrative trend in a way, just for
Hmm.
different genre reasons. I have respect for the movie in that regard. But if we hear the words from Elia Kazan himself, he is actually not the biggest fan of how this film came out. He actually
Yeah.
thinks that the film isn't that great. And I kind of agree with him in a sense. I think this movie is a great metaphor, but I don't know if it's a great movie. I think there is something about it, whether it be in Gregory Peck's performance, whether it be in the overall romance of the film, just the
Hmm.
overall pacing and the structure of it, it doesn't feel like a completed film in many ways. I feel like there's something kind of checked out about it. I don't necessarily love Gregory Peck's performance. I've loved him in other films. I don't necessarily love the romance between Gregory Peck and Dorothy McGuire. I think they're both great actors, and I think they're technically both really good in the movie here. The whole first half of this movie feels like setup for the actual movie. And I
Hmm.
think it takes a real while to really definitively decide what its goal is. And when it gets there, I'm not sure if it arrives at the most insightful conclusion to justify its really interesting idea.
Hmm.
So I'm really torn on the movie as a movie. I love the idea of it for 1947 and what it means for America's relationship in world with regard to World War II and how it fits in this trajectory of Best Picture winners. But
Hmm.
I think in this series thus far, it might be my least favorite movie we've talked about. I don't
Hmm.
think it's quite there yet, and that's unfortunate because I like the ideas at play.
Yeah, it sounds like we're in a similar camp here. I'm with
Okay.
you. I admire what the film is aiming for, but I do think it is terribly misguided in its
Okay.
approach. This is a film that, where we see a character adopt trauma from another group of people
Hmm.
trying to make it his own,
Yeah.
and it does feel a little misguided. Like I
Hmm.
understand
Yeah.
I might be looking at the film through a 2024 lens in that regard instead
It
of a
is dated. It
1947.
it is dated in that regard.
It is very very dated, but I think it also speaks to some of the narrative issues that you're talking about there,
Hmm.
because it's very easy to see Philip struggling with how he is wearing this mask.
Hmm.
Again, he's trying to scrape by with someone else's face, trying
Hmm.
to carry this trauma, even though it is not his. And
Yeah.
it's something that he doesn't really have to bear. And it's something that he's willing, or maybe not willing, but it's something he's able to let go of
Hmm.
and does as soon as his article is
Yeah.
out, as we see
He
at the
hasn't
end of the
lost that
film.
privilege even despite wearing these new shoes.
Absolutely. And I think it's interesting to see how volatile that makes him throughout this film.
Mhm.
I don't think it all works, but there is something a little uh, uh, like I'm
Icky?
struggling to
Kinda
find
icky,
the
maybe?
yeah, like there is
Yeah.
something a little icky about him inside that volatility as he lashes out at other characters, particularly his Jewish secretary that we see at the end of the film,
Mhm.
that I do think beats the wrong drum. Like I don't think that is at all what the film intended to, but it does come off as a little disingenuous.
Yeah,
And I
yeah.
also I like the ideas that it is certainly aiming for here as much as I do admire them. I don't know if the film is able to explore them with any sort of meaningful nuance or variation. A lot of this feels very on the surface.
Hmm.
It's, you know, I guess to put it plainly, this is a film that is about anti-Semitism, yes. However, I think it's mostly this film about complacency, and I wish that the film spent more time on that element of it because that is where it gets interesting. When it's trying to, I guess, dig into its anti-Semitic roots and
Hmm.
where that comes from, and you can really feel the seams of the film working when those things happen in this film, and boy, do they happen often here.
Yeah.
However, I think the film is much more compelling when it starts getting into those ideas of complacency and misguided liberalism. Like how
That's a good
that
point.
comes through at
That's
the
a
end of the
good
film,
point.
I think is fascinating because then it flips the mirror around, and instead of exploring like where does this anti-Semitism come from or why do people act this way,
Hmm.
like those moments in the film are
Yeah.
obvious, and yes,
Yeah.
they're problematic, but again, I don't know if the film gets to any sort of solution there. But where
Right.
it does tend to poke at something that is interesting is, what we see there at the end of the film with Kathy, and while she's affably fighting for justice and seems to say all of the right things, at the same time you see how her good intentions are not as well informed as she thinks they are. Like that is
Yeah.
real, like that to me is where the film
Well,
gets the most interesting, but it's also too late by the time we get there.
yeah, yeah. I have a lot of thoughts on the third act here because I think there's a lot of great things here from the perspective of Kathy. To the point that I'm with you, I also kind of wish that maybe she was the main character in that regard because I
Mm-hmm.
think the idea of someone that does stand up for justice without actually standing up for justice is a great idea.
Mm-hmm.
And we see that talked about nowadays a lot, that you've become very complacent about your surroundings, that just because you say that you support the rights of certain people, but you don't necessarily do or say anything about it, does that make you just as complicit in the problem? I
Mm-hmm.
think that's a really interesting idea. I think where the film stumbles in that regard is I feel like it also kind of makes Kathy out to be the bad guy when she, in a way, rightfully criticizes Phil for going out looking for anti-Semitic responses that almost makes it seem like he's twisting the words of other people just for his own agenda. Like there are things that Phil does that I think are very problematic, and I think
Mm-hmm.
by the way it concludes, it almost makes it look like he was the white savior in all of this. Like, at least, like
Oh, for
given the
sure.
given the form of reconciliation we see at the end between our two romantic characters, right? That romantic partnership there.
Yeah,
I think that was the wrong way to end this movie.
I
I think
agree.
that
Yeah.
that completely undermines any potential interesting ideas that I think both characters
Mm-hmm.
represent. Because I think in that argument that they have, which I think is the best scene in the movie, like the quote unquote breakup scene is probably my favorite scene because it showcases two sides of an argument that I think have their own, I don't want to say villainous intent, but I can understand why you would be a little bit turned off by each of their perspectives, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the points that they make. So to see a reconciliation between the two of them at the end, I think it unwillingly takes a side. And that's where I think the movie does fall apart, and maybe why it does very much feel like a product of its time. I think in
Yeah.
today's market, this would have ended in uh, a much more daring way. I think it certainly would have retained a bit more boldness. I think it would have had more of a sense of tragedy to it. And I think that would have been the right way to do it. So perhaps that's just where
Mm-hmm.
the time capsule element of this movie rings true.
Yeah. Well, it might depend on who's making the film because
Maybe, yeah.
as you're talking there, I am reminded of Civil War and how
Mm,
apolitical it tries to be and
mhm,
fails in that. And hey, maybe picking a side is probably what would have given this film some conviction. And
mm,
because I do agree with you, I think that's where this film loses any momentum that it
yeah.
had gained. And that argument scene that you're invoking there, I do think is compelling. However, at the same time, I feel distanced and disengaged from it because it's coming from two characters that are equally problematic.
Yeah.
The film does not seem to understand. And again, that's where I'm conflating 1947 and
2024. It's not the same time.
2024. It's not the same, but I was not able to watch this film in 1947. So
Mhm,
it is hard to separate the two, but there is a self-righteousness to Philip that the film lacks any awareness toward. And
mhm.
it does get to be particularly insufferable when he is lecturing again to his Jewish secretary. That was
Mm,
the worst moment of the film because he's
yeah,
sustaining this ruse all the
yeah,
time, the
yeah.
whole sequence, as if him doing this for 6 months all of a sudden gave him all the credibility in the world, which
That's
is
the thing.
obviously absurd.
I can't tell if that scene we're supposed to be applauding him. And I feel like in
It felt
execution,
like it was like good for
it
you
feels
for
kind of like a heroic moment. And I'm
yeah.
with you. I couldn't help but feel like Phil is not a very good person by this point.
No.
He's kind of like he's kind of utilized his privilege that already existed in a new way that makes him even worse. It's
Mhm.
like he's using his privilege to take advantage of of an ethnicity now that's not even his. Like it's
It's
a
not his. And
yeah.
that is the biggest sin the film makes, all while maintaining some sort of self-righteousness. And again, I
Mhm.
do love that the film has conviction. And I do think those convictions are palpable at times. And that's where this film is at its strongest for sure. But when you're wearing someone else's trauma as
Mhm.
this mask, something that he can take off at any moment if he chooses, it just doesn't sit all
Yeah.
that well. And it does make the character a little bit disingenuous when
Yeah.
all you're doing is wearing this costume for a couple of months for your own selfish gains, I might add, because he
Mhm.
is writing for this national magazine.
Mhm.
And it's something that he is going to acknowledge in the piece, which he does. Like that, the piece opens up with him admitting that I am a white Christian,
Mhm.
but I pretended to be a Jew for a few months, and look at all the awful things that I experienced.
That's the
And
thing.
that
Yeah.
just doesn't carry as much weight as the Jewish community themselves talking to you about their issues. And that's
Yeah.
where the Dave character here is by far the most captivating character of the film.
Should have had
And
way more time, but he is
should have
so
had more.
underserved here.
John Garfield is incredible in this film. He
Yeah.
is absolutely fantastic. And when he does enter into the story, you really do sense the genuine qualities of the character, his experiences, how that's informed him into who he is. And most of what Philip regurgitates is things that Dave had told him would happen. And so it's not as if he's learning
Yeah.
some of this firsthand because he is wearing the mask,
Yeah.
but in a lot of ways it all stems from his relationship with Dave and the honesty that
Yeah.
comes from that character. And I just don't think the film wrestling with Philip and that ruse and how that integrates into a lot of the conversations he has in this film. Now, at times, it is heartbreaking. Like, we'll talk about the moment he has with his son. Like, that's a great moment.
Mhm.
But when he's talking to his Jewish secretary, not just talking, like lecturing as if I'm better than you for having this experience, or even when he's talking to Kathy there, he is
Mhm.
treating her as like I'm a better person. I'm the one that has a better understanding of this. And maybe he does, but at the same time, he's stealing that trauma.
He's
And
stealing that trauma, and he's trying to
morally, he
educate.
doesn't,
Yeah,
he
he's
doesn't have much ground to stand on.
in many ways what he's doing is kind of abusive to the Jewish people of this time by taking
Yeah.
advantage of them. In many ways, he's taking their experience, and I think that's even emblematic in how this film was represented at the Oscars, because this movie had 4 performances nominated, and of course, John Garfield was not one of them. So, like,
Mhm.
even the movie's success at the Academy Awards is emblematic of the film's problem, I think, is
Yeah.
that it's utilizing the trauma of another group for compelling and selfish gains.
Mhm.
And so, in many ways, Phil himself is a reflection of the Academy at this time, too. And
Yeah.
and that's the problem. If there was at least some acknowledgement that what he was doing was very icky, like we're talking about, I think that makes the movie not only way more interesting, but actually
Mhm.
really compelling and good. I
Yeah.
think there's a version of this movie that exists that does that, and the
Mhm.
execution here is not that, and that's the
Yeah.
unfortunate reality.
I agree, because the more I think about that ending and why it's so stagey and artificial,
Hmm.
circles back to the film's self-awareness with those two
Yeah,
characters, with Philip
yeah,
and Kathy, because it wants us to be on the side of Philip. Look at him. He learned something genuine
hmm,
and he understands more. And Kathy is then forced to have this moment of recognition, this epiphany that I
hmm,
can't just sit there and not say anything, that me being apathetic toward this
yeah,
and listening to others in their anti-Semitism, and I'm becoming complacent and letting it happen, that's problematic.
hmm,
And therefore, I'm going to take an action.
yeah,
And the action she takes is certainly going to ruffle feathers with friends and family, but I'm not just going to be complacent about this anymore. I have learned. I'm going to do something about it.
yeah.
What does Philip learn? What does Philip do? And this to me is what makes the ending so disingenuous, because he's equally problematic, but the film
But
never gives
it
him a
it
moment
it
to
makes it
wrestle
look like
with.
Kathy is the bad guy.
It makes her
That,
look like she's the
like,
bad guy when
yeah,
he is equally problematic. And
yeah.
instead, the film simply shows him as this white savior, as you talked about. And oh, well, Kathy finally saw the white light. Now we can get back together. That to me,
I mean,
it
first off,
is.
they didn't have much romantic chemistry to begin with, so
and, 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 and look, I'm not, I know that there's a larger debate to be had about morality and
yeah,
art doesn't have to invoke your morals all the time. And how many times do you see film Twitter throughout the year
hmm,
just lean into, and not just lean into, but actively praise debauchery we see on screen in movies? It happens
yeah,
all the time.
yeah,
So it's not as if we need art to reflect, like the highest judgment of morals that humanity, can abide by.
yeah.
However, my problem isn't that the behavior is appalling. The issue is the film doesn't think that it's appalling behavior
It
and
doesn't
doesn't want to
recognize it.
wrestle with
Yeah,
it.
it
Yeah, that's
doesn't
the issue.
recognize it, which is unfortunate because I do think there are some interesting ideas brought up in that first half, really more in the first third, as the film does set up its central conceit. When Phil starts telling people that he is Jewish, it's actually surprisingly easy to convince everyone that he's Jewish. Like, it doesn't take any
Mm-hmm.
work, and I think that's a pretty interesting thing. That the film's able to avoid certain stereotypes. That all he has to do is tell people he's Jewish, and people automatically believe it. I
Mm-hmm.
think that's a really interesting idea to show the point of like why are we like why are we so different then? If I can do this easily without any effort, like it makes the stereotyping all the more egregious. Like, I think that's a
Mm-hmm.
pretty interesting notion there. And there's even a moment he has at this party where he networks with this one professor that has some really interesting insight on how he doesn't even tell people he's Jewish anymore, because he says something like, quote, "The world makes it an advantage not to be a Jew." And then even goes on to talk about the difference between Judaism as a religion versus an ethnicity, which is a very
Yes.
topical thing right now. Like, that's a very topical question for
Yes.
many people. Like,
Yeah.
it's in those moments where I feel like the movie was kind of predictive in certain things. And I will give it some credit, if credit is due anywhere, in some of those conversational pieces. But they're all
Mhm.
there for the setup. And they don't conclude or coalesce into a worthy argument on what I think the film is trying to wrestle with and fails to
Mhm.
wrestle in with, as we're talking about. I think it squanders all that potential.
Yeah, yeah, I agree, especially because from scene to scene, as we noted earlier, you see the mechanics of the film working in terms of setting up these
Yeah.
social interactions or these moments where the anti-Semitism is so obvious.
Yeah.
For Philip to experience that and then internalize it
Hmm.
for an article that we never get to read.
I know.
And
It's brushed off pretty quickly.
and the
But
only
what we're
time
told that it's one of the best pieces that the paper has ever written. So I guess,
exactly.
exposition tells us it's important.
Exactly. And the only time that it is brought out in Philip is in these other conversations we talked about earlier, whether it be with
Yeah.
Kathy or there is a moment with Anne near the end of the film, or you know, like it comes out in these small moments that again are kind of they're reflecting his experience in broad strokes
Hmm.
and not necessarily the specifics of these things that he's experiencing. And because Philip never really wrestles with his ruse, he never sees it as something that he's done that's morally gray or whatever.
Yeah.
It just makes those encounters all the more manufactured
Oh
in
yeah.
terms of the scene to scene. Now there are a couple of times where I do think the film slows down to wrestle with something genuine, and
Hmm.
that's um, like the moment that comes to mind the most is the one I mentioned earlier, the moment with the son. And that's where he
Hmm.
has to confront the idea, Philip does, that this is a facade that he's carrying.
Hmm.
Because his son, at one point, we're told, is harassed and bullied, at least verbally. I can't remember if there's any physicality to the
I think it was
altercation,
just
but
verbal, but I mean that's all it needed to be.
that's all it needed to be. You see
Yeah.
that he is really he's recoiling in the moment. He's
Right.
really
Right.
struggling with being told these awful things, and Philip has to talk to him about why someone would do that, why these kids would bully him,
Hmm.
but he can't. He has to make sure that his kid isn't going to go to school and ruin the gag, which
Hmm.
in and of itself is extremely murky.
Yeah.
Like, and
That's
that
true.
happens a couple of times. Like the first time he
Yeah.
talks to his son about, are we really Jewish or are we not? And he's like,
Yeah.
well,
In fact,
no,
he
not
doesn't know it.
really. But
Yeah.
I'm doing a movie trick or whatever he says there.
Yeah. But then
It's like,
he has to tell his son that in a way that doesn't, undermine Judaism and when compared to Christianity.
yes,
That doesn't say Christianity is better. Like
exactly.
that's like that is a hard way to communicate that to a child.
Exactly. So
Yeah.
he's having to communicate that they're equal. One isn't better than the other. Also, don't go to school and tell anyone because this is fake.
Yeah.
Like that's crazy. Like
That's
that's
insane. That is
insane that he has to tell his kid that.
yeah.
And then and it's played like for pragmatism, I guess, in the first time. The second time when he comes home and he's having to deal with his boy and these things that he had heard, and while he still has to console him and comfort him, like what these kids are doing isn't great, and some people they feel these awful feelings and they take it out on people in that way. Also, don't tell
Mhm.
anyone. Like he still has to maintain the ruse. Like it's crazy.
That's
like,
that's why.
And it's in that scene especially, it comes off wild because his son, who is not Jewish, had just experienced these awful things, and as he's comforting him, he still has to make sure that when he goes to school the next day, you don't give this up. Like I do appreciate that moment happens. Like Philip is forced to have that moment. I don't know if it does enough to really wrestle with how
it's a great scene in a vacuum. That's what it is.
Like
there's a great story there.
Yeah. It's crazy like how egregious that is, and I wish the film wrestled with that more, but I'm glad that it at least exists in the movie, and you do see Philip recoil a little bit to what had happened to his son.
And of course, the two best performances in the movie are the ones that don't get nominated for Oscars. One being John Garfield, like we talked about, and here the son. And did you know who plays the son, right? Dean Stockwell, who was Harry Dean Stanton's brother in Paris, Texas.
That's crazy.
Yeah.
No, I did not realize that. No.
That's incredible. But I think, they're the two best performers in the movie because I feel like they're the only ones that are acknowledging the potential nuance of this situation, that there is more underneath the surface than the broad strokes that this movie is addressing. And that's so unfortunate. We often criticize journalism nowadays for too often relishing in broad strokes because that's what gets clicks. The broad strokes is what gets clicks. This movie is basically about how a guy poses undercover to make the biggest clickbait article of the 1940s. That's like it is basically a puff piece, is how it comes off as.
Yep.
But it's meant to be this form of heroism, and it's so frustrating that it doesn't earn that. It's so
I agree.
frustrating.
My favorite performance in the film, hands down, is Celeste Holm. Maybe not my favorite. John Garfield gives the best performance because he's asked to give weight to a film that is otherwise kind of weightless. But Celeste Holm is having the time of her life, and it is electric.
She's good.
So good.
She's good. I'm with you. She's good. She's good.
She's ravishing in this film, and I do love how she gives the film a jolt for all of its hefty themes and its weighty ideas, and it is a film that lingers in the seriousness of its topics. Yeah. And here comes Anne just giving the film this electric beauty that I just absolutely adored. She's incredible here.
With a surprising moment of catharsis at the end that's pretty jolting. She was one of the performers that she actually did win the Oscar for her performance in this movie. And that's you can understand that it's it definitely sticks out in the right ways. It's maybe the loudest performance in the movie, but that doesn't necessarily have to be a bad thing.
But in a great way.
Yeah.
No, I completely agree. And that moment you're talking about at the end, I think, is really fantastic because you do sense the chemistry between her and Philip in those early scenes. And as they're hanging out and talking, I was simply rooting for them more than I ever was Philip and Kathy throughout this film.
And I love Dorothy McGuire as an actress. I think she's gorgeous. I think she's great in many things. One of my childhood favorite movies is Old Yeller, and I think she's so great in that movie. But from a chemistry standpoint, Gregory Peck and Celeste Holm, that should have been the matchup. That should have been the pairing. At least
that should have been the pairing.
If this movie is also trying to function as a romance, which it is, like, in fact, it's kind of primarily functioning as a romance, which might be its biggest problem. But if you are going to still do that, your two lead actors need to have the right chemistry to justify it. And I think Peck and Holm are the ones better suited to make that happen, at least in the small amounts of screen time they have together.
Yeah, I agree. Like, I do think the film gave itself the avenue for Philip and Anne to perhaps develop something, or give, like, the film was never going to just be like, forget Kathy, I'm going to go be with Anne. That was never going to happen, especially in 1947.
Right.
However, well, actually, I take that back. I totally take that back, because in this in this whole movie series, there's been at least a couple of films.
We forgot about Casablanca, right?
We've talked about triangles and people cheating on each other, and it's just like, no, that's just part of the time.
and Avengers moments where someone says, "I'm going
I'm
to
gonna
break
break
that
up this
marriage up."
marriage. Hell yeah! Like I love that.
Teresa
If
Wright, the greatest hero of this whole movie series, if you ask
yeah,
me.
I was waiting for Anne the whole time to be like, you know what? I'm gonna break up that engagement, and she more or less kind of does, I
She
guess,
kind
at
of
the end of
does,
the
but
film.
then it just kind of gets ignored as if it never happened. It's kind of a
Yes,
meaningless scene in context of the whole movie, right?
I agree. No, it
Yeah,
doesn't really lead to anything. Same thing,
yeah.
even with Philip's mother throughout this film doesn't lead to anything.
I feel like
There's
it's just there
moments
for
of
dramatic
panic.
conflict. Yeah,
Yes,
it's like
it's
it's just there to
there.
make us feel bad for Philip. It's
Yeah,
adding to the manufactured quality as if it's trying to trick us into thinking Phil's a good person. I feel like that's
exactly.
what it's doing. And
Exactly.
the scenes with his mother, I think, are pretty tender. I buy them as a mother son pairing. I think it works, but I feel like I'm sensing the puppet strings at play because of how it fits within this specific movie.
Mhm.
Like it feels like it is trying to trick us into thinking, oh yeah, this
Yeah.
Phil guy, he's actually a good guy. Like you're supposed to like him, and
Mhm.
that this is why he loves his mother. He treats his mother well. It's so
Yeah.
that's feel like that's all it's doing.
I agree. And maybe that's where Gregory Peck's performance, and it has been, it's pretty well known now that Peck
Mhm.
and Kazan did not get along when making this film. They did
Right.
not see eye to eye. Now, I do believe that there was an interview with Gregory Peck later on where he realized that we did not see eye to eye. I didn't understand the emotional nuance he was going for. And if I could redo the film now, I think I could give him exactly what
Yeah.
he wanted. But I do think it is absolutely a big part of this film. His performance, I
Mhm.
think, it just isn't very good. And
It seems
I like
disconnected,
it
honestly.
seems disconnected, and time has not been kind to it all that
Yeah.
much either, because when you combine his performance with all of these other qualities that we've talked about with Philip that the film just refuses to wrestle with and acknowledge,
Mhm.
there is not much redeeming about Philip as a
No,
character.
there
And
isn't. You're
and
right.
Peck's performance doesn't inject any charm or anything that would draw us to the character. It'd be one thing if the character is, morally ambiguous and
Or yeah,
murky.
meant to be a little bit icky, like we're talking about. And I
Yeah, and
think,
it's
I think his, yeah,
hold,
yeah. Go ahead, go
let
ahead.
me finish the thought. But yes, if it's meant to be ambiguous and murky, yet he brings an infectious charm to the performance,
Hmm.
and he draws us in with what he's doing on screen and on camera, then maybe you have a little bit of a different reaction to the character. But
Hmm.
when you have the performance you get and the writing that you get, and then throughout the whole film, you're like, this guy's just insufferable. Like he
Hmm.
might be learning lessons and realizing that anti-Semitism is more widespread and brazen than he thought previously, and it's a problem. And as a country, we need to address it. Like the lessons learned are more than valid, but the
Yeah,
reasons in which he learned those things, again, extremely, extremely murky.
I, yeah.
So,
Mhm.
despite the lessons learned and how valid they are, there's not much about the character that goes, you know what, I think I like this guy.
Well, yeah. I that's why I think his performance is disconnected in a lot of ways because
Hmm.
like I think it's very one note that if there is an arc, I didn't see it.
Yeah.
So and it's ironic because apparently even Celeste Holm has said she didn't have any fun working with Gregory Peck either. So clearly, when someone is disconnected in the making of a movie, whether it be a director or an actor, in this case, maybe someone like Gregory Peck, that's going to strain the relationship with everyone else making the movie with them. And that's probably what's happening there. But yeah, it just seems like he didn't understand the material or something. Because yeah, if he
Hmm.
brought some kind of charm to this, then it at least matches what I think the film is going for. But his coldness, that seems to suggest the nuance that maybe we are trying to get from the movie that the movie's then not giving us. So if anything, I feel like the big disconnect is the movie Hollywood wants to produce and the performance that Peck is maybe inadvertently giving.
Mhm.
It's like that coldness and that despondency would have probably benefited a movie that is a bit more self-aware and that ickiness that we're talking
Mhm.
about, right? And the movie itself seems like it's completely oblivious to that, like we're talking about.
Yes.
So that makes his performance feel like it's out of left field. It feels like it's from a completely different movie. Gregory
Mhm.
Peck has given much better performances, and I can't believe he was nominated for this one. I
I know.
don't think it's a good performance.
Yeah, I don't think it's great either. I don't want to say that it's actively bad. Like your phrasing of disconnected, I think, is really appropriate here.
Yeah.
He just doesn't seem like he's on the same page with Kazan or any of the writing here. And it does make the character very cold. And it's, it makes for a lot of
Which is
gawkishness throughout the
what yeah.
film
Yeah,
with what his character is doing.
which is so ironic given Elia Kazan's history as a filmmaker. He was sort of known for letting his actors do the whole method acting thing. I mean, he's
Yeah.
worked with Marlon Brando twice. Another movie we might talk about if we do the 50s, right?
Mm-hmm.
For Best Picture series, On the Waterfront, great
Mm-hmm.
movie.
Yeah.
Streetcar Named Desire,
Love that film too.
great
Yeah.
movie. East
Yeah.
of Eden, great performance
Yeah.
there from James Dean.
Yeah.
Have you seen A Face in the Crowd, the film that basically introduced Andy Griffith?
I don't think that I have. I
That's
don't think
another
so.
great movie. The
Yeah.
point here is that Elia Kazan's made a lot of great movies that I still love to this day. Gentleman's Agreement, sorry, is not one of them. I don't think it is.
No, I'm with you. Yeah, I don't like this film all that much too. In fact,
Mm,
I wasn't sure if I could go this far coming into the conversation. I wanted to wait to have the conversation, but my
mm.
immediate thought after watching the film was, I think this is my least favorite we've covered so far.
It's not even close. It is.
Yeah.
It's my least favorite of the ones we've covered.
Yeah. And again, it's not like what it's aiming for. I really do appreciate. I
Hmm.
love the convictions it has. I just think that its execution is pretty woeful.
Yeah,
And
I'm
and
with you.
also just the opportunities, the missed opportunities, because
Hmm.
I do think it introduces, again, far too late, but the biggest surprise of the film is those ideas of misguided liberalism we see at the end.
Hmm.
I think that's fantastic. If that's what this
Yeah,
whole film would have been, I mean, holy Lord. I mean, talk about a film that would have been decades ahead of its time and something that's still extremely relevant today.
agreed.
And I'm glad that even in 1947, they were willing to address those ideas
Yeah,
in the film. It's a little bit too late. But the whole idea
sadly. Yeah.
with Kathy and letting these things slide and why that's not okay. It's great. The villainizing of her inside of that though. Don't love that.
Which I
Don't
don't.
love
Well, I don't mind that if Phil was
that.
rightfully
And that's
recognized
what I
as
mean.
another villain. That's the
Exactly.
thing. Yeah,
That's that, and I guess that's
yeah,
what I was trying to get to.
yeah.
Like
But the
the
one sidedness of that villainy
yes,
is the problem.
yes, because she does absolutely miss the mark in terms of her
Hmm.
response to some of the things that Philip and
Yeah.
eventually Dave talked to her about. Like,
Hmm.
there's no doubt that her liberalism was misguided at times.
Yeah. Yeah.
It is a lesson to be learned for sure.
Absolutely.
But when you contrast that to Philip, that's what makes it not
Problematic.
great.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm with you. I'm with you on that.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
not
Any
a great
final
movie.
thoughts?
Not a great
No.
movie. And looking at the films it was up against for Best Picture, I haven't seen everything here. I have seen Miracle on 34th Street, which I think
Yeah.
is an adorable
Same.
film.
Yeah.
That's an adorable film, and I think that was probably my favorite of the five. If I had seen all of them, at least I would guess, given my appreciation of that film. I
Hmm.
have seen Great Expectations because I know I've seen a few of David Lean's earlier films. It's been a while since I've seen it, but I know I remember liking it quite a bit. So I'm sure I would
Hmm.
like this over this one. But those are
Yeah.
the other two that I've seen in the five there.
Yeah. Great Expectations was going to be the one that I noted. I would absolutely have voted for that over
Okay.
Gentleman's Agreement. And I'm with you. Miracle on 34th Street. Love that film, or like adorable little film. Very
Yeah.
much do agree with you there.
Yep, absolutely.
The Bishop's Wife, I don't believe I have seen. That would be a first time watch for me. So I need
Same with
to give that one a
Crossfire.
go.
Yeah,
Yeah.
haven't seen those two.
Yeah, Gentleman's Agreement. Not too much of a fan of the film.
I don't agree with
Um,
that, gentleman.
no, absolutely not. But I
Terrible
do
pun, but
I do respect Kazan though for sticking to his convictions because he was that like they very much tried to get him to not make this movie,
yeah, yeah.
and he went ahead with it
Well,
anyway.
and if it got him to make better movies because of it, then I'm glad it exists. I'm glad it
Yeah.
exists in this way because, like I said, I've loved a lot of his films. And if he had to make this in order for a movie like On the Waterfront to get made, in order for East of Eden and A Streetcar Named Desire to get made, then I'm glad it's here. I'm glad this movie
Mhm.
got made in the way that it did, in the flaws and all. I'm glad it exists in this way.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. So, I am looking forward to moving on to next week. We got two more with Hamlet and All the King's Men. Hamlet, it's William Shakespeare,
I have seen
Laurence
that one.
Olivier.
It's been a while. I think I saw it back in high school.
Hmm.
So this will be one of those situations where it technically isn't a first time watch for me, but it might feel like one
Hmm.
nowadays because it has been so long. Um, so I get a 1.5 first time watch or something like
One and a
that,
half.
maybe. Yeah.
You,
But all the King's Men I have not seen.
okay. Yeah, I have not seen that one either. So,
Yeah.
very much looking forward to seeing Hamlet, a film that went up against The Red Shoes, The Treasure of Sierra Madre.
Well, I already know it
Pretty
wasn't the
heavy
best of
hitters.
those movies. That I'll just simply say that. There's no way it's better than The Red Shoes.
Yeah, I agree. So we'll talk about
Yeah.
Hamlet in 1948 next week, as you know the country and Hollywood was certainly turning away from the war.
It
From
was.
this,
Yeah.
I mean, I don't necessarily think we'll get into the 1950s immediately. We probably will
Mhm.
pick a different decade.
Maybe. Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, even when you look at 1950, 51, like you start to see the country expanding into a lot of different things, which is
Yep.
exciting. There's an
Yeah.
eclectic mix of winners there for sure.
Yeah, for sure. I'm with you.
But yeah, this has been fun. I've enjoyed it, despite Gentleman's Agreement. This has been a fun series so far. We'll
Yeah.
round out with
Yeah.
Hamlet and All the King's Men in the next 2 weeks.